We usually say Aboriginal Australian rather than Australian Aboriginal because the Aboriginal of Australia is as much Australian as any other Australian. However, in my title, I have deliberately reversed the word order and said Australian Aboriginal because this method of memorization is Aboriginal rather than Australian or more Aboriginal than Australian. The Aboriginals of Australia are not a homogeneous community. They are a group of diverse communities scattered all over the continent. However, there is one thing which is common to all these groups, and that is orality. It is not literacy, but orality, which is the overriding factor of Australian Aboriginal culture. In orality, what matters is the spoken word and not the written word. In orality, communication is through word of mouth. In orality, knowledge is handed down from generation to generation, not through the written form, but through the oral form. The Aboriginals had spectacular memorization capacities, despite the fact that they did not enjoy the support of literacy. They were able to memorize thousands and thousands of bits of information. Without the support of the written word, they could commit to memory thousands and thousands of items of information. For example, they could easily, effortlessly remember the names of hundreds of trees, not just the names, but also their features. Hundreds of birds, not just the names of hundreds of birds, but also their behavior. Information regarding the seasons, the weather, social codes, spiritual practices, political norms. Now the question arises, how come that the Aboriginals, without the support of the written word, could commit to memory such fantastic amounts of information? The Aboriginals are a very outdoor people. They have an extremely bonded relationship with the land in which they live. They are closely, thoroughly familiar with the landscape around them. The Aboriginal memorization method utilizes the landscape to help the Aboriginal to fix in his memory the information that he wants to fix. Each item of information is connected to a feature in the landscape. I have to repeat that the Aboriginal is extremely familiar with the landscape. The features of the landscape could include the trees, the rocks, the ditches, the pathways, the woods, the clearings, the hills, and the information that is to be memorized is connected mentally with these features. Not just a connection, a narrative is also used. Thus, we have three focal points here. The first is the target material. The target material is what is to be memorized. The second is the landscape feature. The third is the narrative. The narrative is used to bind the target material to the landscape feature. Suppose the Aboriginal has to memorize the names of 700 birds. A narrative is built in order to connect each bird, the name of each bird, to one feature in the landscape. And using the narrative and the landscape feature, the Aboriginal commits to memory the name of the bird. The Aboriginal memorization method is somewhat similar to the memory palace method of classical Rome, but is vastly superior to the memory palace method. In fact, I have created a video on the memory palace method. I call it the memory house method. I shall give the link in the description box. Please look it up. The memory palace method depends on the memory palace, or as I call it, the memory house, which is more psychological than physical, more imaginary than real. The landscape is very much physical. It's all around the person attempting to carry out the memorization. The second reason for saying that the Aboriginal method is superior to the memory palace method is that the same landscape can be used by every member of the group to memorize, to carry out the memorization exercise. A group which is profoundly familiar with a particular landscape can use the landscape in the same way, in the same manner, in order to carry out the memorization exercise. In fact, this is precisely what the Aboriginals did. And as the memorization was more a group effort than an individual effort, it became much, much easier. The third reason for saying that the Aboriginal method is better than the memory palace method is that the landscape has a close bond with the community, or rather, the community has a close bond with the landscape. And because there is an emotional and spiritual bond between the members of the community and a landscape in which they are located, the memorization exercise becomes easier. In the memory palace method, the individual has to construct the memory palace. Your memory palace can be very different from my memory palace. And it takes a tremendous effort of imagination in order to construct it. But in the Aboriginal method, what is used is a landscape. There is no pressure on the imagination. There is no demand on the imagination. The landscape is very much there. Not just that, the common landscape, which is very close to the heart of every member of the group, is used in order to carry out the memorization exercise. A 2021 research paper discusses an experiment conducted at Monash University, Victoria, Australia, using the Aboriginal method, Australian Aboriginal method of memorization, as well as the memory palace method of memorization. 76 students from the medical school of Monash University were given the responsibility of memorizing 20 butterfly names. 20 butterfly names. The names of butterflies were chosen in order to prevent the students from getting the impression that the experiment had something to do with their academic program. 25 students used the memory palace method 26 students used the Australian Aboriginal method, and the last group, comprising 25 students, used untrained recall. The result of the experiment was that it was categorically demonstrated that the Australian Aboriginal method is superior to the memory palace method. As for untrained recall, it was nothing short of disaster. Furthermore, the students using the Aboriginal method, the Australian Aboriginal method, found it found its use an extremely enjoyable outdoor experience. Choose a landscape to be used as the foundation of the memorization exercise. Ideally, the landscape should have a number of varied features. For example, a lawn by itself is useless because there are no varied features in the lawn. There is only grass. Your landscape should have trees, shrubs, rocks, pathways, ditches, a number of varied features. Then affix each item in the target material to each feature in the landscape. Use a narrative to bond the target item and the feature. The strain on the imagination is much less here than in the memory palace method because the landscape is there around you. Walk through the landscape repeatedly, using the narrative to affix the target item on each feature in sequence. Repeat the exercise for a number of days, and you can be sure that you will be able to commit the target material to memory. After the initial intensive memorization process lasting a number of days, the number of days depends on the nature, the complexity, and the quantum of the target material. You can carry out the exercise at intervals. Let us say that you use 5 days to carry out intensive memorization and you have acquired a reasonable grip over the target material. After that, you can carry out the memorization exercises at intervals. The intervals should become wider and wider as you proceed further. And finally, the target material will be permanently etched in your memory.